April 11, 1945. Morning. The western bank of the Elbe River. Lieutenant General William Simpson stood with binoculars pressed to his face, looking east. Beyond the water lay open highway, broken resistance, and the capital of the Reich. Berlin was 50 miles away. Not symbolically. Physically. His army could reach it in a day. Simpson commanded the U.S. Ninth Army, more than 300,000 men, fully supplied, organized, and intact. His units had crossed Germany faster than any planner had predicted. German formations ahead of him were no longer formations. They were columns of surrender. White flags appeared before American tanks came into view. Prisoners begged to be taken west, away from the Red Army closing from the east. Nothing on the ground suggested delay. Simpson understood what he was seeing. The war, at least in Europe, could be ended by movement, not caution. He picked up the field telephone and called his superior, General Omar Bradley. His request was precise and professional. He stated the distance. He stated the condition of the roads. He stated the collapse of German resistance. He asked for permission to advance. The answer came back without hesitation. No. The order was explicit. Ninth Army was to halt at the Elbe. No reconnaissance forward. No probing attacks. No exploitation. The advance toward Berlin was over. Simpson did not argue. He asked for clarification. There was none. The order stood. Within hours, the same instruction reached other formations. To the south, George Patton's Third Army was told to turn away from the east and redirect its momentum toward Bavaria and Austria. The most aggressive American commander in Europe was ordered to abandon the capital and hunt something else. The decision was not framed as temporary. It was not conditional. It was final. On the riverbank, American soldiers consolidated positions they no longer needed. Bridges were secured that would not be crossed. Engines were shut down. Weapons were cleaned instead of fired. Across the river, the road to Berlin remained empty. The decision had been made far from the Elbe, based not on what Simpson could see through his binoculars, but on what others feared might exist somewhere else. The war would end soon. But not here. By April 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was only the shape of its ending. After the Rhine crossings in March, American armies ceased fighting a coherent opponent. They moved through the German interior at a speed that exceeded every pre-war estimate. Supply columns struggled to keep up, not because of enemy action, but because the front advanced too quickly. Entire German units dissolved without orders. Officers surrendered with maps still in their pockets. Soldiers abandoned weapons simply to run west. The Ninth Army exemplified this collapse. In just over 3 weeks, Simpson's formations advanced more than 200 miles. They bypassed fortified towns, ignored flanks, and kept moving. Resistance rarely slowed them for more than hours. When contact occurred, it was brief and uneven. German forces no longer fought for victory. They fought for position at surrender. Crucially, this collapse was not limited to a single sector. Intelligence reports from across the front told the same story. The Wehrmacht had no operational reserves in the West. Armored divisions no longer existed as maneuver forces. The Siegfried Line, once a symbol of German defensive depth, stood largely empty. Concrete without troops. Bunkers without ammunition. From a purely military perspective, this created a fleeting condition. Berlin was not just politically important. It was operationally exposed. The capital was defended by units assembled from remnants, trainees, and desperate formations scraped together too late. German commanders understood this. That is why surrender accelerated in front of American lines. They knew who would arrive first. For Simpson, the opportunity was clear and measurable. The roads to Berlin were intact. Bridges stood. Fuel was sufficient. Artillery and air support were available in overwhelming quantity. There was no requirement for complex maneuver or prolonged siege. The city could be reached before a coherent defense formed, before political arrangements solidified, before the war's end was choreographed by conference tables rather than movement. This was not speculation. It was observation. Simpson was not alone in recognizing it. His staff understood it. Subordinate commanders assumed it. To the south, Patton's Third Army saw the same opening from a different angle. German command reports intercepted by Allied intelligence confirmed the absence of meaningful resistance. Even Soviet commanders, pressing from the east, understood the race was close. The opportunity, however, extended beyond Berlin itself. Seizing the capital would collapse remaining German coordination instantly. It would eliminate any illusion of continued resistance. It would determine the physical presence of Allied forces at the moment of surrender, not just their legal claims afterward. Occupation zones could be renegotiated. Facts on the ground mattered more than ink on agreements. This opportunity was temporary. Every day that passed allowed Soviet forces to close the distance. Every delay transferred leverage. Once Berlin fell, it would not matter how quickly American armies could have arrived. The moment would be gone. Militarily, there was little argument against exploitation. Risk existed, but it was limited and quantifiable. Casualties would occur, but not at the scale already accepted elsewhere. The German will to fight was exhausted. The war had become a question of motion, not force. The opportunity was not reckless. It was decisive. What made it exceptional was not that American forces could take Berlin, but that they could do so without paying the price normally associated with such a prize. The enemy was collapsing faster than planners had dared to hope. The conditions of success were already present. All that was required was permission. That permission did not come. The opportunity closed not because it disappeared on the ground, but because it was overridden elsewhere by a fear unrelated to what Simpson could see through his binoculars. The armies were ready. The road was open. The moment passed and used. The warning did not come from the battlefield. It came from intelligence desks, situation maps, and reports that arrived faster than they could be verified. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower was not watching empty roads to Berlin. He was reading assessments that described a different war still waiting to be fought. For months, Allied intelligence had been tracking a disturbing pattern. German units were withdrawing southward, not retreating in panic, but moving with apparent purpose toward the mountains of Bavaria and Western Austria. Radio intercepts hinted at regrouping. Prisoner interrogations repeated the same rumor. Propaganda broadcasts spoke of a final stand. The name attached to this threat was the National Redoubt. According to the reports placed on Eisenhower's desk, the Nazi regime had prepared a last fortress in the Alps, a place where geography replaced manpower. Narrow passes, high ground, weather, underground facilities carved into rock, stockpiles of food and ammunition sufficient for years. Elite SS formations, fanatically loyal, prepared to fight on even after Berlin fell. The numbers were alarming. Intelligence estimates suggested 200,000 to 300,000 German troops moving into the region. Not remnants, but organized forces. The implication was clear. If the Allies focused on Berlin, they might decapitate the regime while leaving its body alive and dangerous. Eisenhower had reasons to take this seriously. He had spent years fighting an enemy capable of deception, delay, and sudden counterattack. He had seen how quickly assumptions collapsed at the Ardennes. He knew that symbolic victories did not end wars if organized resistance survived elsewhere. Above all, he was responsible not for headlines, but for casualty lists. The reports reinforced his instincts. They warned that the redoubt would transform the war into something else entirely. Not conventional advance, but mountain warfare, prolonged sieges, guerrilla resistance, months, possibly years, of fighting after the capital fell. The specter raised was not defeat, but endless continuation. Eisenhower prepared accordingly. He began to view Berlin as a distraction, important politically, but secondary militarily. A city that could be taken, yes, but at the cost of leaving the real threat untouched. His planning shifted focus from race to containment, from momentum to denial. This assessment was shared selectively. Field commanders were not shown the full picture. Simpson was not briefed on the intelligence driving the halt. Patton was not invited into the deliberation. The warning was treated as a strategic concern best handled at the highest level, away from the pressure of commanders eager to finish the war. What Eisenhower did not know was how fragile the warning was. The intelligence was thin. Much of it originated from German propaganda channels. Joseph Goebbels had understood the Allied mindset with precision. He knew the Americans feared prolonged casualties more than delayed victory. The redoubt narrative was designed to exploit that fear. Fake documents circulated. Controlled leaks reached neutral intermediaries. Radio traffic was manipulated to suggest organized withdrawals that did not exist. Prisoners repeated stories they had been told to repeat. The image of an Alpine fortress grew through repetition, not confirmation. There was no single moment when Eisenhower was deceived. There was a gradual accumulation of doubt. Each report reinforced the last. Each warning made caution appear prudent. In the absence of contradictory evidence, the threat became real by default. Eisenhower's credibility rested on avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. The Ardennes had already shown how wrong assumptions could cost lives. Faced with a choice between a visible prize and an invisible danger, he prepared to neutralize the danger first. The warning, as he understood it, demanded action, not toward Berlin, but away from it. The action followed quickly, and it followed centrally. On April 12, 1945, Dwight Eisenhower translated assessment into order. It was not debated at the front. It was not phrased as guidance. It was directive. The American advance eastward would stop at the Elbe. The priority of the war in Europe would shift south. For William Simpson, the order required nothing less than paralysis. Ninth Army was instructed to consolidate, secure crossings, and wait. Reconnaissance units were pulled back. Armored spearheads were halted with engines still warm. Units that had been advancing for weeks without pause were told that the war would end somewhere else. To the south, the order struck harder. George Patton's Third Army was not told to pause. It was told to turn. Entire corps pivoted away from Berlin and Czechoslovakia and drove toward Bavaria and Austria. The most aggressive operational force in Europe was reassigned to hunt an enemy that existed only on maps and intelligence summaries. Patton reacted exactly as expected. He protested immediately and forcefully. He argued that Berlin was the decisive objective. He argued that German resistance was finished. He argued that momentum mattered more than caution at this stage of the war. His objections were not emotional. They were operational. They were dismissed. Eisenhower did not engage Patton's reasoning point by point. He did not attempt to convince him. He invoked authority and ended the discussion. The decision had been made, and it would not be revisited. The mechanics of the pivot were massive. Logistics routes were reoriented. Air support plans were rewritten. Intelligence priorities shifted overnight from the German capital to Alpine valleys. Maps that had pointed east for months were replaced with new ones pointing south. Entire planning staffs adjusted to a mission whose target no longer had a fixed location. This was not hesitation. It was commitment. Eisenhower committed American power to the destruction of the redoubt before it could be proven to exist. He chose to preempt a threat rather than exploit an opportunity. The action reflected his understanding of responsibility. Ending the war mattered less than preventing it from continuing in a different form. The political implications were acknowledged but subordinated. Occupation zones had been discussed at Yalta, but Eisenhower believed battlefield realities could still influence outcomes. He also believed that a prolonged guerrilla war in the Alps would erase any advantage gained by capturing Berlin first. His calculus prioritized finality over symbolism. The action isolated Berlin deliberately. American forces became spectators to the final act of the European war. Soviet armies massed, redeployed, and prepared their assault without American competition. The race ended not at the city gates, but at a river where one side stopped by order. Patton's columns moved through southern Germany, encountering little resistance. Villages surrendered. Towns opened their gates. The expected fanatical SS defense did not materialize. But the operation continued, because turning back would mean acknowledging error. At SHAF, the action was treated as confirmation of prudence. Every quiet valley reinforced the belief that the threat was being neutralized before it could manifest. Absence of resistance was interpreted not as evidence of deception, but as success. The logic became circular and self-sustaining. The action locked the outcome in place. Once American armies committed south, Berlin was no longer reachable in time. The political reality Eisenhower sought to avoid became inevitable. Soviet forces would take the capital alone. The end of the war would reflect the geometry of orders, not the potential of forces. The action did not fail tactically. It failed strategically only in retrospect. At the moment it was executed, it was disciplined, coherent, and irreversible. The machinery of war obeyed without question. The decision moved from map to road to history with no further opportunity for correction. The war in Europe was about to end. But the shape of the peace had already been altered by the turn. The consequences unfolded in silence at first. Along the Elbe, American units settled into positions they had expected to abandon within hours. Tanks were parked facing east with no orders to advance. Engineers improved crossings they would never use. Soldiers watched smoke rise on the horizon and listened to distant thunder that was not weather. It was artillery. Across the river, the war did not pause. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army opened its final assault on Berlin. It was not a maneuver. It was an expenditure. Marshal Zhukov committed overwhelming force because time, not economy, had become the priority. Stalin did not want Berlin taken efficiently. He wanted it taken first. The scale was unprecedented. Millions of men, tens of thousands of guns. Entire fronts compressed into a single objective. The city was defended by what remained of the German state. Exhausted regulars, Volkssturm militias, teenagers, and foreign volunteers with no route of retreat. There was no expectation of survival, only instruction. From the western bank of the Elbe, American soldiers could see the sky change color at night. The horizon flickered continuously. The sound carried for miles. It was not battle as they knew it. It was annihilation by volume. They did not move. The contrast was stark enough to feel unreal. On one side of the river, coffee was brewed. Mail was delivered. Men cleaned weapons already clean. On the other, a capital was being erased street by street. The difference was not capability. It was instruction. German soldiers understood this better than anyone. Units that had been surrendering en masse to American forces only days earlier now fought desperately against the Soviets. Not because they believed in victory, but because they feared capture. The same men who dropped rifles at the sight of an American tank manned barricades when the attackers wore red stars. This mattered. Berlin was not defended to stop the Red Army. It was defended to slow it, to extract time at any cost. Stalin accepted the price. The casualties were staggering and immediate. Entire formations were destroyed for blocks of ground that held no military value beyond proximity. All of it was unnecessary from a purely operational perspective. Ninth Army could have reached the city before this began. Not after. Before. The defenses Zhukov encountered were assembled under pressure, not prepared in depth. German commanders later acknowledged that the Americans would have faced resistance, but not this resistance. The will to fight was selective. The American halt transformed the final battle into something else entirely. It was no longer about ending the war quickly. It was about ending it on predetermined terms. The cost was paid by those on the eastern approach. Along the Elbe, confusion turned into resignation. Junior officers fielded questions they could not answer. Why were they waiting? Why were they not moving? Why were they listening to a battle they were equipped to end? There was no explanation that made sense at platoon level. Orders had been given. That was all. One officer wrote later that the silence was worse than combat. In combat, action explained itself. Here, restraint did not. While Berlin burned, American armies to the south advanced into Bavaria and Austria expecting a fight that never came. Patton's columns pushed through mountain valleys prepared for ambush. They found none. Villages surrendered immediately. SS units melted away or turned themselves in. The terrain that intelligence had described as a fortress behaved like open country. No underground factories appeared. No organized resistance materialized. No stockpiles for years of war were discovered. That the war had ended without their final movement. Some would later describe it as relief. Others as frustration. Few described it as necessary. The larger consequence emerged after the victory parades ended. Eastern Europe did not reopen. Governments installed under Soviet supervision did not leave. What had been temporary became structural. Influence followed the path of armies, not intentions. The American decision had not handed Berlin to Stalin as a gift. It had declined to take it when the opportunity existed. The result was the same. This was not betrayal. It was calculation under uncertainty. Eisenhower had chosen to avoid a hypothetical future war in the Alps and instead accepted a concrete political outcome in Central Europe. The hypothetical war never existed. The political outcome did. That is the weight of consequence. Not that Berlin was lost, but that it was lost by design without full awareness of the trade being made. The battlefield cost was avoided. The geopolitical cost was deferred. At the Elbe, the war ended quietly. Beyond it, something else began. The post-war record stripped the decision of its urgency and left only its mechanics. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, Allied investigators began reviewing what had been found in southern Germany and Austria. The results were unambiguous. There was no national redoubt, no fortified Alpine command center, no underground industrial network capable of sustaining prolonged resistance, no massed SS armies waiting to fight on. The threat that had driven the pivot did not exist. Captured German officers were questioned extensively. None confirmed the presence of a coordinated Alpine fortress. Interrogations revealed a pattern instead. Units had retreated south because that was the direction away from the Red Army. Rumors of a final stand had been encouraged, not organized. The idea of the redoubt had lived far more vividly in Allied intelligence files than in German operational planning. The role of propaganda became clearer with time. Joseph Goebbels had not invented the concept from nothing. He had amplified fragments of contingency thinking into a coherent fiction. Radio broadcasts hinted at resistance. Controlled leaks fed neutral observers. Prisoners repeated stories they believed would improve their treatment. Allied analysts, primed by fear of a prolonged war, assembled these fragments into a structure that felt credible because it aligned with their worst expectations. Eisenhower was not careless. He was cautious. Post-war assessments inside the U.S. Army acknowledged this explicitly. The decision to halt at the Elbe was described as reasonable given the intelligence available at the time. The failure lay not in intent, but in validation. The intelligence was not challenged aggressively enough because the cost of being wrong appeared higher than the cost of delay. George Patton's private correspondence tells a sharper story. As his forces advanced through the Alps, he grew increasingly bitter. The absence of resistance was impossible to ignore. No prepared defenses appeared. No stockpiles were uncovered. German units surrendered with relief, not fanaticism. In letters written just days before Germany's capitulation, Patton stated bluntly that the Allies had been deceived. He predicted that the consequences would be political rather than military, and that they would last for decades. William Simpson's post-war reflections were quieter. He did not accuse. He questioned. He wrote that he wondered whether confrontation in April would have been preferable to accommodation afterward. His doubt was not about Berlin itself, but about momentum. He believed that decisions made while armies were still moving carried different weight than those made after they stopped. Soviet records, opened decades later, added another dimension. They confirmed that the Red Army had expected American competition for Berlin. Zhukov accelerated his assault precisely because he feared a change of mind. Stalin had ordered speed, not economy. The cost in lives was accepted as the price of certainty. The city had to be taken before diplomacy or reconsideration could intervene. The line that formed at the Elbe hardened quickly. Occupation zones solidified. Temporary arrangements became permanent borders. Political systems installed under Soviet authority did not dissolve when the war ended. They consolidated. What had been agreed in principle at Yalta was enforced in practice by presence on the ground. The intelligence error did not cause the Cold War, but it shaped its geography. American planners later acknowledged that once Berlin fell to the Red Army alone, leverage disappeared. Negotiation became theoretical. Influence followed control. The opportunity to shape post-war Europe through movement, rather than agreement, had passed. Eisenhower never publicly regretted the decision. In his memoirs, he defended it as necessary prudence. He emphasized casualty avoidance and responsibility to the men under his command. He did not deny that the redoubt proved illusory. He argued that acting on incomplete intelligence was unavoidable in war. The record does not contradict him. It clarifies the cost. The halt at the Elbe did not prolong the war. It ended it cleanly. What it altered was the settlement. The battlefield was concluded efficiently. The peace that followed was divided. The post-war documents show no conspiracy, no betrayal, no secret bargain to give Berlin away. They show a system reacting rationally to fear, and fear being shaped by deception. The greatest intelligence success of the final months of the war was not an Allied achievement. It belonged to a collapsing regime that no longer had the power to stop its enemies, but still had the ability to mislead them. By the time the truth became undeniable, the war was over, and the map was already drawn. The verdict is settled by sequence, not speculation. Dwight Eisenhower did not surrender Berlin out of sympathy, alliance loyalty, or diplomatic naivete. He declined to take it because he believed the real war might continue elsewhere. That belief was wrong, but it was not irrational. It was constructed from intelligence that appeared consistent, urgent, and dangerous. The decision was made to prevent a future catastrophe, not to concede a present victory. In doing so, Eisenhower chose certainty over opportunity. He eliminated a threat that did not exist and accepted an outcome that did. The battlefield ended cleanly. The political landscape did not. Berlin was not lost in combat. It was lost in calculation. The armies were capable. The road was open. The moment was real. What intervened was fear shaped by deception and caution reinforced by responsibility. The result was a boundary drawn not by resistance, but by restraint. The national redoubt never fought. It never delayed. It never cost a single American life. Yet it redirected entire armies and determined where the war would stop. The Red Army paid for Berlin in blood. The Western Allies paid for it in leverage. No treaty could reverse what movement might have secured. No negotiation could recover ground never taken. Once the capital fell under a single flag, the balance of post-war Europe was fixed. This was not betrayal. It was the price of believing intelligence that aligned too closely with worst-case fears. It was the cost of choosing to end a war safely rather than finish it decisively. The Iron Curtain did not descend because of ideology alone. It descended along a river where one army halted and another did not. That line held for decades. The case is closed. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped the world after the shooting stopped, subscribe and leave your perspective below.